So I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but judging by the amount of merchandising that is currently going on at the moment, I think there may actually be a major football tournament upon us. Yes, it's Euro 2020. And I have traded these tournaments over a large number of years. And there are some key pointers I can sort of give you in terms of the general outlook and the sort of stuff that I'm looking for. And that is because I've archived data over a very large number of years. And it's important that you look at these tournaments and understand how they're different from what you would typically do, because it's very easy to just go into these things and start deploying the same strategies, or looking at the liquidity and thinking, wow, look at the amount of money that's in these markets, and perhaps bumping up your stakes. But there are some key differences with the way that you would typically look at a tournament as opposed to domestic football. So the first Euro tournament I ever looked at was way back in 2004. This was just as my career on Betfair was beginning to skyrocket. And when you look back then, it's quite interesting. I always would recommend that you archive data. So you screenshot stuff that you've done, you gather stuff, park it. Even if you never use it initially, you may return to it at some point in the future. So I've kept all my records for as long as I can remember. And I mean, have a look at the semi-final lineup that we had back in 2004. Can you remember who actually won in 2004? Because if you look at these particular markets, you can see not only does Betfair look quite quaint back in 2004, but the odds that were available on the markets at these particular moment in time was quite remarkable given the outcome of the 2004 tournament. The other thing that was quite remarkable, which gives you some insight as to how these tournaments play out very often, was the infamous match between Sweden and Denmark. Because for both sides to progress, they needed a draw. Not only did they need to draw, they needed to draw 2-2. That was the result that would see both of them progress. And despite everybody saying, well, that's definitely not going to happen and we're not going to play for a 2-2 draw, guess what happened? The match ended up 2-2. So yeah, I got lots of memories back from 2004. As an England fan, I don't have particularly great memories of 2016, but you know, there have been some interesting moments throughout these particular tournaments, and the tournament has actually changed dramatically over a very large number of years, because if you go back to 1992, there were only 8 teams in this particular tournament, whereas last time out, I'm trying to remember how many we had. I think we had 24 teams last time out. So the style and shape of the tournament has changed dramatically over the years, and this is why it needs to be treated differently, because when you look at this particular year, of course, the idea was that it was going to be played right across Europe, and it still is, but not in some places and it is in others. And Wales are in Azerbaijan, England are in England, and it's all very different in terms of what we would typically expect, especially given the current circumstances. So it's important that you understand and approach it differently because of that particular perspective. I probably won't be trading it as much as I would do domestic football, because there are very strong form lines in domestic football and certain characteristics which you don't tend to get in a tournament. And because the format of the tournament keeps changing, makes it difficult to compare things that have happened. But let's talk about what you can do and some of the key characteristics that you see within the tournament itself. In 2016, the average match turned over about 5 million before the match had actually started. And that gradually rose to about 13 million when the match had finished. So you can see these matches are pretty big. This is an average amount. It will be bigger for some matches and not so much for others. So when you get sort of matches where there's not much to play out and between teams that aren't particularly popular, that number will be lower, and necessarily it will be a little bit higher when we get to matches that have a lot more interest within them. If we actually look at the final in 2016, it attracted about 10 million before the match had started and ended up about 23 million in total. So obviously, as you progress through the tournament, you get bigger and bigger amounts as the focus drills down to a smaller number of matches and the importance of those matches goes up. So yeah, the liquidity follows the importance of those individual matches. Interestingly though, when you look at the matches that are played on different days, there isn't that much difference in aggregate overall. I went back and looked at all of these matches over a long period of time, and the money doesn't particularly vary that much depending upon the day of the week or the time in which that match is played. So it's fairly consistent when you look at those earlier group stages. As we get to the latter stage of the tournament, necessarily the volume goes up. But what's the biggest indicator of the matches that are going to have the largest volume on them? Let me ask you that question for a second and see if you can answer that. Which matches are going to turn over the largest amount of money? Well, the answer is England matches. And I'm not being patriotic here. I'm just pointing out the way that the market works. The curious thing about England matches is in 2016, they attracted about double the liquidity that you would typically expect on an ordinary match. So there's a lot of focus on those England matches. There's a lot of money gets driven into them. And as a consequence, they tend to yield the biggest amounts of turnover and the most amount of liquidity. That's just the way that it seems to work. And I've noticed this in other tournaments as well, but particularly from the data that I looked at, that was very prominent that it occurs very much at the Euro. So I'm expecting that pattern of behaviour to repeat again. And also, you tend to find the odds on the next match tend to get pulled in a little bit if a team performs well in one match. So if you're looking at the pre-off market, you may want to keep an eye on that because the prices start to get discounted fairly quickly, especially if it's England. When you look at the number of goals, the average number of goals is 2.12 in 2016. And typically you would expect a lower number of goals. So if you're pursuing a Betfair trading strategy or a betting strategy, whatever you're attempting to do, you will tend to find that the number of goals tends to be lower. Now, I'm going to put a qualifier on that. In the group stages, where you've got less competitive matches, that will generally be a little bit higher, fairly obviously. But as we progress through the tournament, and there's a strong incentive not to lose, and one of the best ways of not to lose is to not concede a goal, you will find that the number of goals sort of diminishes. So you tend to sit yourself on strategies that revolve around fewer goals. Now, typically, most of these matches would be played at a neutral venue. So in my mind, when I'm looking at goal ratings and trying to assess how many goals there will be in a match, if it's at a neutral venue, then you sort of deduct from the match about 0.4 of a goal. That's typically how you do it because home advantage is typically worth about 0.4 of a goal. So you would tend to sort of dissipate that and you would tend to discount that out of any of the sort of expectations that you have. But of course, in this tournament, we've got this really confusing situation where some teams actually will have home advantage, but they won't have the crowd. So I think, there probably will be a bit of a home advantage, but probably not as much as it would have been if they were played in front of full crowds. That's going to disadvantage teams that have actually got the benefit of being able to play in the country of origin. As we move through to the latter stages of the competition, then the incentive to score becomes very, very strong, especially late on within a football match. So you may get slightly lower goals as we move through the latter part of the tournament, but you're likely to get more late goals, and there's a very, very strong incentive to score at that particular point. If you're about to go out of the competition in the knockout stages, then you may as well go for it. And as a consequence, you tend to see a lot of frenetic activity towards the end of the match. So it's worth speculating in that particular period on the basis that the incentive to score is incredibly strong at that particular moment in time. Now, when we look at the tournament overall, I do like going for outsiders, as you know. And typically that has paid off on a lot of the Euro tournaments. Going for teams that are unpopular, obviously a lot of them are going to get knocked out in the group stages, but you do get the odd one that manages to sneak through. The favoured team within that particular group, something goes wrong, or perhaps they're not playing particularly well, or there's a freaky goal, or, injuries to players, or, we do have the situation now where hopefully none of the players will have to pull out because of COVID-19, but it's not impossible. So it's probably worth putting a little bit of money on some of the outsiders there, not with the anticipation that they'll win the tournament, but the anticipation that they may progress to the next stage. And typically I do play around a lot in the to qualify markets because laying at short odds on the to qualify markets has been a popular strategy of mine at the World Cup and in the Euros. That seems to be a good place to go. Now, the problem you have with this type of tournament is they are seeded. So you would expect progression of most of the favoured teams in each of those individual groups. But of course, you do have other ways to qualify to the next stage as well. And as a consequence, those are the things that are going to drive the to qualify market, and some of the outsiders perhaps getting in at shorter prices. Football's highly variable. So as a consequence, anything could happen within 90 minutes or over the course of a few games, especially given the structure of the tournament. So one of the things I would say, especially because football is very variable, I actually prefer to do domestic football, simply because any edge that you've got, any strategy that you deploy can play out over the course of the season and hundreds of games. So when I'm trading pre-off horse racing, I would like to make a profit on the day, but I can't guarantee it. But I will almost certainly make a profit by the end of the week. But that's purely a function of having an edge and doing loads and loads of markets. The problem you have at the Euros is the volume is higher, so you may be tempted to stake higher. But the problem is the variability is also a lot higher as well. You could have a perfectly legitimate strategy that just does not pay off in this particular tournament. So try and keep your staking realistic. And I would suggest that maybe what you should do is probably keep your staking in a similar way, despite the higher liquidity, that you would do in domestic football, because the variability means that you may pursue the right strategy, but it may just not pay off in this individual tournament. So be careful of that. Make sure that you take that into account. You've got less games for everything to play out, and therefore you could end up on the wrong side of that. And if you're overstaking, that's a bit of a disaster. I do look at teams in the run-up to the tournament to give me an indication as to ones that I think will perform well or perhaps above expectations. So some of these will be at bigger odds, and I'm just expecting them to do better than their odds suggest. But I'm sort of looking at teams like Denmark, Italy, Portugal, and you throw in the odd outsider there, somebody like Switzerland. Teams that have certain characteristics that are playing in their favour. So, for example, Italy are going to be playing at home effectively all of the time, and therefore probably expect their odds to shorten a little bit as long as they play well. But you're sort of feeling that maybe a few things are coming together that could play into their favour there. Teams that I'm thinking may not do as well as expected. I'm thinking that the Netherlands may not do as well as expected, or Spain. And Spain have had some problems in the run-up to this particular tournament that may work against them. And for the outsiders, I'm not expecting much to happen with Turkey. But, in a knockout, we have the group stages and then the knockout side of things. And with the increased variability, I think it's very difficult to actually pick teams that will or won't do well, because one good or bad result will define their entire tournament. But those are the sort of teams that I've been looking at in terms of perhaps, performing or underperforming at some point or another. You'll notice that I haven't mentioned England in there. That is because, obviously I'm biased, and I have a general rule of thumb that I won't participate on that or have any particular judgment on it, because I think that's fatal, especially where money and risk is involved. But anyhow, those are my thoughts. I hope that they are useful for you and give you some guidance in terms of what I look at, the way that I approach the tournament, and my general view on things. And whether you're betting or trading or just watching, I just hope that you have a really good tournament and that your team performs and gives you a little bit of pride. It's going to be an interesting tournament. It's a really, really busy time of year now, because all of a sudden we're going to have a whole load of sporting action that presents many opportunities for you. But I hope at least that's given you a little bit of insight into what I'm looking at and what I've seen in prior years. Anyhow, I hope that video was useful for you.